So if you walk into an old-growth forest, your immediate, baseline perception is just stillness.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
Just massive silent trunks everywhere.
Exactly. You see this collection of individual organisms standing completely isolated from one another, and it looks like they're just competing for the same limited canopy sunlight and soil water.
And for a very long time, I mean, that is exactly how empirical science viewed the forest, too, as this sort of biological gladiator arena.
A total free-for-all. But if you look beneath the soil today, using modern biochemical tracking, you find something entirely different. You find, millions of miles of fungal threads connecting the root systems of nearly every tree.
It's incredible.
It really is. You find the subterranean network where carbon is actively traded, where immune responses are coordinated, and where chemical warning signals are transmitted across vast distances using a structured biological syntax.
Because the forest is not a collection of isolated objects at all. It is a deeply relational, communicative, and intelligent web.
Right.
And discovering that fundamentally alters the way we view the natural world.
Totally.
It moves us from a worldview of dead mechanical parts to a worldview of profound interdependence.
Which brings us to the core mission of our deep dive today. For you listening, we are looking at a stack of philosophical and scientific sources that all point to this singular, massive, paradigm-shifting argument.
Yeah, and it's an argument that really challenges how we live day to day.
Right. Because in our modern culture, we operate under this assumed dichotomy. We are constantly told that science is the realm of hard data and structural reality, while spirituality is just, the realm of subjective feeling and unseen belief.
The pervasive assumption is that if you want to understand the mechanics of reality, you turn to science. And if you want comfort or meaning, you turn to spirituality. You just keep them in separate boxes. If you are deeply committed to the scientific method, the cultural expectation is that you view spirituality with, polite skepticism.
Polite at best, yeah. But the material we are analyzing today completely dismantles that division. The argument here is that science and spirituality are not enemies, and they aren't even studying separate realities.
No, not at all.
They are actually two distinct interfaces trying to map the exact same underlying architecture of life.
To really grasp that, we have to revisit a word that has been severely distorted in the modern era, which is metaphysics.
Oh boy, yeah.
Because if you hear that term today, you likely associate it with crystal healing, astrology, or just vague supernatural concepts. It's been co-opted as shorthand for the woo of the world.
I instantly think of a dimly lit bookstore smelling of heavy incense,
Exactly. But in its classical philosophical sense, metaphysics has absolutely nothing to do with magic or the supernatural. It is simply the study of reality's underlying structure. It asks the most fundamental questions, like, what is the framework of reality? How is it organized? What is the nature of existence itself?
It is the search for the blueprint.
Precisely. And within that classical pursuit, there is a central concept known as the logos.
The logos?
Right. The logos refers to the invariant pattern of truth. It is the underlying order and logic that remains consistent across all the chaos and change of the physical universe.
Wow.
And the central thesis we are exploring today is that both rigorous science and authentic spirituality are in pursuit of the logos. They are just using completely different methodologies to decode it.
So let's look at those two methodologies, because understanding their different approaches is where this gets really fascinating. Science operates as the empirical discipline of truth. Right. It requires an external interface. It relies on instrumentation to measure, test, observe, and mathematically model reality. We are talking about sequencing genomes, measuring the decay rate of isotopes, mapping the cosmic microwave background.
It's the physical data, whereas spirituality functions as the non-empirical discipline of truth. It investigates the architecture of reality through disciplined internal recognition.
Which is much harder to put on a spreadsheet.
Well, yeah, because it focuses on the elements of existence that cannot be quantified on a physical scale, but are undeniably real and structural to the human experience.
Like what?
Things like the mechanics of awareness, the genesis of suffering, the nature of conscience, and our capacity for inner transformation.
I love the analogy of thinking of reality as a single unified house. So science is one method of studying that house. You bring in engineers to measure the tensile strength of the foundational concrete or calculate the load-bearing capacity of the walls and determine the exact thermal efficiency of the windows.
Which is vital.
Yeah.
Without that structural math, the house just collapses.
Right, that empirical rigor is non-negotiable if you want the house to stand up to a hurricane. But spirituality is studying what turns that physical structure into a home.
Yes, the lived experience.
Exactly. It's the investigation of the life occurring inside those walls, the quality of the relationships, the sense of psychological safety, the warmth of the interactions.
And notice how calculating the thermal efficiency of the windows doesn't contradict the feeling of warmth in the home.
Right. They aren't at odds.
In fact, the physical efficiency directly enables the environment where that warmth can exist. They are deeply intertwined. The empirical blueprint and the non-empirical experience are just two interfaces mapping the exact same house.
The conflict really only arises when we assume the empirical interface is the only valid way to gather data. We have this ingrained bias that the heavy machinery of science is the adult in the room, and the non-empirical realm is just a repository for unverified feelings.
But the timeline of human discovery tells a completely different story. Spirituality operates in the domain of what must first be recognized before it can ever be measured.
Because it doesn't require a multi-million-dollar laboratory to, begin its investigation.
Precisely. Spiritual inquiry is not bottlenecked by whatever physical instruments happen to exist in a given century. A practitioner thousands of years ago could sit in disciplined observation and recognize the logos, the structural pattern of reality, through lived experience long before an empirical tool was ever invented to verify it.
Okay, I want to push back on this slightly, just to play devil's advocate for a second.
Sure, go for it.
Because there is a trap here. Claiming that spirituality can, quote, recognize things before they can be measured sounds dangerously close to giving people a free pass to just make up whatever they want.
Right, the slippery slope.
Yeah, like someone could claim that their anxiety is caused by invisible gremlins in their blood and wave away the lack of evidence by saying, well, science just hasn't built the tool to measure my gremlins yet.
That is a critical distinction to make, and it really comes down to the rigor of the methodology. The non-empirical interface is not an excuse for magical thinking or unchecked subjective bias. Authentic spiritual traditions employ highly disciplined observation. They engage in rigorous phenomenological work.
Define phenomenological for us in this context, just so we're on the same page.
Yeah, so phenomenology is the philosophical and systematic study of the structures of consciousness from the first-person perspective. It isn't just sitting around feeling your feelings.
Right, it's not just journaling about a bad day.
Exactly. It is observing the mechanics of your own mind with the same cold, detached precision that a biologist uses to observe a petri dish. When ancient contemplative practitioners mapped the mind, they weren't guessing.
Wow.
Through thousands of hours of disciplined attention, they recognize that suffering isn't just something that passively happens to you. It is actively generated by a specific structural mechanism, mainly attachment and the rigid ego.
They were internally mapping the nervous system.
They really were. They mapped the effects of neuroplasticity millennia before the fMRI machine was invented. They recognized that focused attention alters the baseline state of awareness. They identified how deeply held trauma stores itself, not just in memory, but in the physical tension of the body.
Which is something we talk about constantly now in modern psychology.
Yeah, right. But they did this phenomenologically. Fast forward to the modern era, and what happens? Clinical psychology and neuroscience develop the empirical tools, functional magnetic resonance imaging, EEG caps, biofeedback monitors.
And they end up pointing those tools at the exact same territories.
Yes. They find that deep meditation physically thickens the prefrontal cortex and shrinks the amygdala, which is the brain's fear center. They mapped the default mode network and discovered that the neurological mechanism responsible for our sense of a rigid self actually quiets down during deep contemplative states.
Which directly verifies the ancient spiritual concept of ego dissolution.
Exactly. Science brings the empirical receipts for the non-empirical recognitions.
This shift is where the profound philosophical implications really start to click into place for me. Because if spiritual traditions have historically recognized the deeper relational structures of reality first, what happens when our scientific instruments finally become sophisticated enough to see those same structures?
The mechanistic worldview shattered.
Totally shattered.
Because following the scientific revolution, the dominant paradigm was deeply reductionist. The universe was viewed as a giant, dead machine made of isolated, separate parts just bumping into one another in a void.
Life was just a random chemical accident.
Right. And humans were viewed as the only conscious, intelligent beings wandering around on a lifeless rock, surrounded by basically biological automatons.
Animals were literally viewed as machines. I mean, Descartes argued that an animal crying out in pain was no different than the grinding of gears in a broken clock.
Which is horrifying to think about now.
It's brutal.
But that was the peak of the mechanistic interface.
Oh,
But as the empirical tools grew sharper as we moved beyond basic taxonomy and started sequencing DNA, tracking neural pathways in invertebrates, and modeling entire ecosystems, science began to discover a world that looks overwhelmingly like the one spiritual traditions have described for centuries.
a world defined by relationship.
Yes, relationship, intelligence, and communication everywhere.
Let's look at the research coming out about non-human intelligence, because this completely upends the hierarchy we've built. We used to think that a centralized, top-down brain, like the human cerebral cortex, was the only way consciousness or complex problem-solving could even exist.
Encephalopods completely dismantle that assumption.
The octopuses.
Right. When marine biologists study octopuses today, they aren't looking at a simple stimulus response machine. They are looking at an incredibly alien, highly advanced form of distributed intelligence.
Because they don't have a single brain, right?
Well, they do have a central brain, but an octopus doesn't rely on it to call all the shots. Like 2/3 of its neurons are actually distributed throughout its 8 arms.
Meaning the arms can essentially think for themselves.
They literally can. The arms can taste, touch, and make localized decisions independent of the central brain. Yet the organism functions as a unified, highly intelligent whole.
That is just wild.
They solve complex multi-step puzzles, they navigate mazes, they exhibit play behavior. They can even recognize and remember individual human faces, holding grudges against specific researchers who wronged them.
Oh, I've read about that. Like they'll squirt water at the one guy who annoyed them 6 months ago.
Exactly. It is a profound structural intelligence that evolved on a completely separate branch of the evolutionary tree, which proves that the universe generates complex awareness through multiple diverse pathways.
And it isn't just cephalopods either. The way we understand animal communication is undergoing a massive revolution. I mean, I grew up thinking bird calls were essentially just biological noise, like a generic alarm for danger or a basic instinctual mating cry.
We all did. But we now have the bioacoustics technology to analyze the exact frequencies and structures of those calls. And researchers studying species like the black-capped chickadee or Gunnison's prairie dog have discovered that they're not just making noise, they're using actual structured vocabulary.
Okay, wait, how complex does that vocabulary get? Like, are we talking actual sentences?
Well, take prairie dogs, for example. They don't just have a generic alarm cry. Their chirps contain dense acoustic information that encodes the size, shape, color, and speed of an approaching predator.
Are you serious?
I am. They have different calls for a coyote, a human, or a hawk. They even incorporate regional dialects and distinct phonetic syntax. They are communicating highly specific observational data to one another.
So they're speaking, I mean, it's a non-human language communicating objective reality across a network.
It forces us to confront the fact that the underlying architecture of life is communicative. We are not a lonely outpost of intelligence in a dead world. We are embedded in a deeply communicative, aware biosphere.
Let's go back to the forest we started with, because the mechanism behind that wood wide web perfectly illustrates this convergence of empirical science and spiritual intuition. For a long time, the spiritual concept that all things are connected sounded like a nice poetic metaphor.
A very nice metaphor. Until we discovered the mycorrhizal network. Beneath the soil of a forest, specialized fungi interface directly with the root tips of the trees. Now, the fungi cannot photosynthesize to create their own sugars, but they are incredibly efficient at mining the soil for raw minerals like phosphorus and nitrogen. The trees, conversely, have an abundance of carbon from photosynthesis, but struggle to gather enough minerals, so they plug into each
It's
other.
a biological marketplace.
Exactly.
But how do the trees actually interact with each other through this fungus? Like, I know they share resources, but what is the physical mechanism moving a nutrient from one oak tree to another oak tree?
It operates through source sink dynamics.
Okay.
This is driven by chemical and electrical pressure gradients within the fungal tubes. So if a large, older tree, what ecologists call a hub tree or mother tree, is producing excess carbon, and a younger sapling shaded by the canopy is struggling to survive, the network automatically shunts the excess carbon from the source to the sink.
Wow.
The fungal threads physically transport the isotopes.
So a dying tree doesn't just passively rot and fade away?
No, not at all. When a tree is dying and realizes its biological systems are failing, it will actively push its remaining carbon reserves and sometimes crucial defensive enzymes down into its roots and flush them into the mycorrhizal network to sustain the surrounding healthy trees.
That sounds almost like an intentional altruistic act. And they send warning signals through this network too, right? What does a chemical warning actually look like?
So if a tree is attacked by aphids or invasive beeters, it doesn't just suffer in isolation. It releases defensive chemical signals, volatile organic compounds, both into the air and down through the fungal network,
And the other trees pick it up.
instantly. When the neighboring trees detect these specific chemical signatures, their own biological systems react. They begin pumping their leaves full of bitter tannins or other defensive chemicals before the insects ever even reach them.
The forest is behaving as a single, unified immune system.
It is. And when modern ecology maps out those carbon transfers and tracks those volatile organic compounds, they are doing incredibly rigorous empirical science. But the structural reality they are revealing, an interdependent, sacrificial, highly communicative network, is fundamentally indistinguishable from the spiritual concept of oneness.
That is just beautiful. The empirical interface finally reaches a level of sophistication where it can physically measure the profound interconnectedness that the non-empirical interface recognized centuries ago.
Right. And the science doesn't demystify the forest. It doesn't strip away the wonder by reducing it to just carbon and fungi.
Yeah.
If anything, the science becomes humbled by the staggering complexity of the logos it is uncovering.
The data provides the physical architecture for the poetry. It proves that the contemplative traditions weren't just projecting human emotions onto a dead world, they were accurately tracking the real structural interdependence of the universe.
This is exactly why the modern assumption that science and spirituality are at war is such a tragedy. When you force people to choose a side, you rob them of a complete understanding of reality.
You're getting half the picture.
Right. If you rely solely on empirical data, you gain the mechanics of the universe, but you risk losing the meaning, the moral weight, and the lived experience of that profound connection. But if you rely entirely on the non-empirical, without the rigorous grounding and verification of the scientific method, you risk drifting into untethered fantasy. We require both interfaces to fully perceive the architecture of life.
Science rigorously measures what can be measured, and spirituality rigorously investigates what must first be recognized. Together, they provide the full blueprint. They give us the structural integrity of the walls and the profound warmth of the life lived inside them.
And the deeper human knowledge progresses, the more these two methods converge. Rigorous science continually catches up to ancient recognitions of interconnection, and authentic spirituality is continually refined and grounded by the physical verifications of science.
It changes everything about how you interact with the world around you. We started this deep dive looking at a massive artificial wall built between the realm of facts and the realm of belief. And we've seen that the wall is just an illusion. They are two vital, deeply complementary tools attempting to decode the exact same reality.
The exact same reality.
Which leaves you with a fascinating question to chew on as we wrap up today. If science and spirituality are on this collision course, inevitably overlapping more and more as our empirical tools improve, consider the most profound, deeply spiritual experience you have ever had. Maybe it was a moment of overwhelming awe staring at a mountain range, a flash of inexplicable deep intuition, or the visceral, ego-dissolving feeling of unconditional love. What if those experiences aren't just passing subjective emotional states? What if they are the pre-empirical scouts? What if your capacity for awe is actually an evolutionary tool recognizing a structural reality that we just haven't learned how to map with our instruments yet? The deeper we look at the structure of existence, the more we realize that the wonder and the math of the universe are, and always have been, the exact same thing.